Independence for Change, Clare Daly.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. And I suppose, first out, Minister, I think it's important to say that I think there are many very good aspects to the bill. I think the issues of dealing with sexual offences are long overdue, but I think it is so big and deals with so many different and diverse areas that its actual weakness is that it's trying to do too much. And in that, then, I think we run the serious risk of leaving ourselves open to doing damage where none is intended. I do think that some of the areas can be addressed through amendment later on, issues around consent, issues around people with disabilities and so on. But I think Section 4, in relation to the proposal of criminalising the purchase of sex, is, to my mind, not amendable and actually should be withdrawn if this bill is to go further. And the reason for that, I suppose, starting off, is quite simple. The Minister and the Government's position in putting this forward is very much done from the point of view, a point of view that we'd all agree with, a desire to maybe end prostitution and to protect sex workers, and we would love to do that. But I suppose my starting point is your legislation actually has the very real potential to do the opposite of what it intends and to place sex workers in more danger rather than less. And we have to take that on board. I don't say it lightly. I say it in light of the very serious research has been done into this area, because the current proposal that's before us actually is contrasting sharply with international trends which are moving in the direction of recommending decriminalisation of sex work as the best way of dealing with this complex and multifaceted issue. That decision, or that trend, is based on research and data-based evidence, and anything we do should be based on not emotion, not generalisations, but research and data. And, you know, I think it's interesting that earlier, when, or a month or two ago, Deputy Catherine Martin actually asked the Minister about this issue in terms of research before we do this, and the Minister correctly pointed out the difficulty in collecting data when she said this is owing, at least in part, to the covert nature of the activity and the understandable reluctance on the part of individuals to identify themselves as sellers or buyers of sex. Now, if we're saying that now, introducing a criminal penalty to make sex work will make it more covert and hidden and lessen the chances of us getting that data. And how can you measure whether something is successful or not if you haven't done the homework beforehand into knowing what your starting point is? And the experience of other countries is that anything that changes the dynamic between the buyer and the seller of sex can actually have the effect of disempowering the sex worker and putting them under greater risk. And where buyers, it makes perfect sense, where buyers of sex face a risk of prosecution, they're inevitably going to take steps to avoid detection, which essentially means making the activity less visible. And some people might like that, but the consequence of that is that the health and safety of sex workers is being threatened. And I think we have to start from the point of view that when this legislation was first drafted in 2013, a huge amount of evidence has come to light since then, and that evidence is not being taken into account. The debate has moved on this issue. Firstly, since the time the legislation was mooted, we've had the first and only comprehensive island-based research into this area, with a study done by Queen's University into this precise area. It's incredibly comprehensive and it's incredibly clear. The overwhelming majority of sex workers and their clients would not be deterred from the activity if this legislation was introduced. They'd feel more unsafe, and in actual fact their experience since then has been that the activity is more unsafe. And I think that's a key flaw in the legislation, that it doesn't take account of the evidence from other jurisdictions where this type of model has been put forward, the changes that have taken place, and critically the lack of consultation with those involved in the activity, because that's quite glaring. And I find it utterly condescending that people would make comments about other people's lives without asking them first. Now, sex workers, like everybody else, are not a generic group. People end up in the activity through many different routes, and anybody who tries to say that they're all victims, they're all drug addicts, they're all trafficked, that's not the entire picture. But to have a consultation process or draft legislation which meant that only 2 people currently engaged in sex work made an appearance before the Justice Committee despite months of deliberations, and those who organise sex workers in Ireland had one one-hour meeting with the Minister in advance of drafting legislation. It is not good enough, and it is silencing a legitimate voice in our society, and it's, if you like, very much doing the opposite of what we're saying we're doing, and I find that regrettable. I think it's utterly contrast with the approach, for example, taken by the Unionist Students in Ireland, which I think is an incredibly interesting one, because their consultation was about 20 times the amount of the Minister's office, and they're not even bringing in legislation. First of all, they spoke to men and women. They spoke to trans men and women. They talked to current students, ex-students, Irish and non-Irish. And as a result of that actual engagement with students who engage in sex work, they changed their policy. They move from a position of supporting the type of idea that the government is putting forward as the best way of dealing with the activity to a different position. And I think that's incredibly important, actually, because they carried out a 2-year research programme, provided an environment for students to talk safely without being shamed, and it's worth pointing out that their evidence showed that in response to the growing cost of education, there has been a comparative rise in students engaged in sex work. How could there not be? It's the economic imperative that again is putting that choice, inverted commas, but limited choice, call it what you like, in front of those people. And I think that as a result of that engagement, the Unionist Students in Ireland now fully support decriminalisation. They're not the only ones. Many organisations are beginning to re-look at this issue, and yet the legislation hasn't caught up. The Irish Migrant Rights Centre have reviewed their positions. They've concluded that Part 4 of the Act is a knee-jerk reaction, that the legislation needs to be clear, or else it will cause more damage. They believe that actually it's the sex workers themselves who are best placed to assist the Gardaí and victims of trafficking. And actually the regularisation of the undocumented is far more important than criminal legislation. We know that Amnesty, HIV Ireland, the UN Special Rapporteur on Health, Global Commission on Health, the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, and on, these organisations all support the model of decriminalisation of sex work. Now, why would these reputable human rights organisations support that if sex work was trafficking and presented in that manner? Trafficking is an abhorrent crime. It's already criminalised, and it should be actually even more criminalised, and those who conduct it should be severely punished. We have laws there to deal with that, as indeed I heard other deputies talking about children being involved. It is criminal to have sex with children now, and that should remain. It's criminal to engage in violence against women. Whether that woman is engaged in sex work or not, it is a criminal activity, and we have laws dealing with that, and we should be enforcing that legislation. Of course, trafficking and violence go with what is badly called the sex industry. It is very much part and parcel of it, but there are laws there dealing with those aspects of it. And actually, conflating that with a consensual arrangement between two adults takes away the limited resources of the state in its ability to be able to deal with that. Let's look at it like this, and I'm not in any way being flippant about it, but violence and bad attitudes to women exist whether sex work does or not. The statistics will show that the most violent place for a woman to be is not working in the sex trade, but to be in a relationship or to be married, because domestic violence is the biggest harmer and perpetrator of violence against women. But nobody is seriously putting forward the idea that we should ban relationships, we should outlaw marriage as a way of protecting women. That would be totally unrealistic. We need to educate society and put in the resources so that women in that situation have the ability to leave violent relationships, and we need to educate our society, our men and our women, as regards how adult human beings should deal with each other in terms of human interaction. But to say that the people involved in sex work don't know what they're talking about, or that their views are not relevant, I would find that unacceptable in any phase of life. And I know that mightn't be something that people might like to hear. It's not an activity I would particularly like to engage in myself or to have my daughter engaged in. I know that many people who make that choice do it because their other options are limited. It's not necessarily that that would be their first choice, but whether we like it or not, it's a rational choice. And the only way of dealing with that is to remove the barriers that put them in the situation of having to make that choice, be it to get money for your college fees, be it to get money for your kids, be it because you can't get a decent paying job whereby you'll be able to look after your kids and organise childminding or whatever. Unless we deal with those issues, well then the compulsion or the choice will remain. And I really think the day of sort of Frank Duff's moral crusade to save women is long gone. We have to hear the voices of those who are currently engaged in sex work. And I will go back to the comprehensive academic research conducted on this island with people in this situation and read its findings. And you couldn't read its findings and support the model that has been put forward by the government in the legislation today in terms of Section 4, because I think Kate McGrew, one of the organisers of the Sex Workers Alliance, made the point, a crusade to sort of shut down prostitution, to turn off the red light, really just leaves us in the dark. And I think that's not going to be a step forward. The idea of sort of shaming sex workers or portraying the narrative in the sense of men's violence against women, assuming that all clients are male, all sex workers are female, is an imbalance. It's not the full story. Obviously, the issue is rooted in women's inequality and how society is organised, but that is not the full picture. And the idea of saying that the women involved haven't made a rational choice that's best for them, or that they don't know what they can do with their own bodies, to me is not an appropriate way of going forward. I mean, I don't have a huge amount of time, but there was some really incredible testimony given by students involved in sex work, such as Keelan, aged 26, a sex worker from Cork, and a student who had been active as a sex worker for 5 years. And she made the point that there are no frills in this. It isn't the way it's portrayed on the screen with belle de jour glamour or Pretty Woman where they fall madly in love with you. I don't feel a connection with them, but I do have some clients that I'm fond of. I mostly work with men, and yes, some of them have been disrespectful, but none of them have been threatening and caused me harm. I know this isn't everybody's experience, but it is mine. I've met women who were forced into doing sex work. This is utterly awful. They want to leave, they can't. That should be looked at, but bringing in this measure, criminalising what we do, won't help them. These women will still be desperate and in need of money, but they'll be driven underground to get it. We need supports for those who want to leave the industry and safe working environments. The bill won't do either, and I think that's important. I think the work that was done by Barrister Michael Lynn and commissioned by Sway, incredibly well-grounded academic and research-based piece of work into this area, where he evolved into a position of coming to the conclusion that, actual fact, this legislation would violate the human rights of sex workers. His key points in relation to that were, first of all, the lack of assessing of the real impact of the Swedish model, the penalties against brothel keeping and so on are likely to contravene the human rights of sex workers, and very critical of the fact that there is no review in the legislation. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the Nordic or the Swedish model, but the reality is this is really the American model. Outlaw prostitution, criminalise the purchase of sex, and it'll all go away, and we don't need to trouble ourselves about that. But sadly, there is no model or shortcut or magic formula in doing this. The idea that by criminalising the purchase of sex, you will minimise demand, people won't want to engage the services of sex workers, and therefore that will reduce the marketing and trafficking, it's just utter nonsense, and it doesn't stand up to any serious examination of the research. The Points from Sweden are at best ambiguous. A report by the British Society of Criminology into the effects of Swedish laws on sex work, published in 2014, found there was no reliable data to say that there was any overall decline in people selling sex, and that the law had increased the dangers. It made it harder for people to access harm reduction services, not being able to carry condoms in case you be caught, the buyers having more power, forcing you to negotiate and go to an area that you don't feel safe in, and so on. And in actual fact, what was seen at the start initially of a decline in street prostitution in Sweden initially is actually not even unique to Sweden at all. It's actually been a correlating trend in other countries where new technology has been brought in and people don't go on the streets as much. They use the internet and so on. I think bringing in this measure doesn't end prostitution or sex work, it just hides it better, and that makes it more dangerous for the sex worker themselves. I think the most comprehensive report, which I won't have time to deal with in detail, in relation to Norway, done by Amnesty International, really brings out very clearly the lack of evidence to support any claim that the laws there have decreased prostitution at all. And even Sweden now says at best it hasn't increased. But the Nordic model in Norway certainly hasn't reduced it. And you'll know, Minister, that Amnesty have called for the government to refrain from criminalisation of any aspect of the transaction, and instead to look at the 1993 Act and to distinguish between the exploitation and coercion of a third party rather than third parties that don't cause harm. And this has been a recurring theme of some of the other speakers. Everybody knows that pimps and people who profit off women using violence and emotional abuse are reprehensible and should be dealt with, but often working with another person is your best protection, be that two sex workers working together, be it a friend that they may employ as security to watch their back or whatever. If you want to take those measures under our existing legislation, that third party could lead you to be coming under the umbrella of the Act. And in that sense, I think all of the evidence is pointing to the direction that criminalisation of any aspect of consensual adult sex work makes sex workers more and not less vulnerable, and that sadly is unfortunately the reality of it. I mean, people made reference to the case in Galway yesterday. I thought it was interesting that the sergeant in court referred to the women aged between 20 and 30 as little girls who wouldn't have the wherewithal to organise things for themselves. The claim was made by the state that these women were trafficked. The women denied it themselves. But God Almighty, what does it say about our laws? If the state are claiming that these are the victims of trafficking, and we bring them to court and we prosecute them, and we take what limited money that they have off them, we fine them, how are we supposed to expect them to pay it back again? Because the only experience sex workers can get to get the money back is to engage in more sex work to get it again. And it's that type of approach, sadly, of using measures which I think previous governments or in other jurisdictions put forward for the best reasons, thinking that we were doing the right thing as a society, of distinguishing between say third parties that were violating people and the women themselves who were involved in that activity. But those laws now already have been used to undermine the position of the women who everybody says we want to protect, and I believe that everybody believes that the sex workers, nobody wants to see them injured by this legislation. But we have to step back and look at what has happened in other jurisdictions and say that in actual fact, if we go down this road, then that's the likely unintended consequence of our actions. So I do think it's really important that we do look at amendments later on. I know there's been moves put saying that there should be a review of the legislation after 12 months or whatever it should be, but that, I think, continuing or including the clause before that, then that negates that. Because if we put in this clause, as night follows day, sex work in Ireland will be driven even further underground than it is now, and it will make it harder. The Minister herself has said this previously, for us to get the evidence, not the emotion, the evidence to achieve what all of us want to achieve, I think, a society whereby women are respected and whereby the rights of sex workers are not undermined, their human rights are respected, and all of the research shows that the direction we're going in is the wrong way. And I would again urge the Minister to take cognizance of the fact that this debate is very different now than it was 3 years ago, 4 years ago when this started. A lot of organisations who have a long history in women's rights and human rights protection and so on have changed their position in light of experience. And I think we're lucky in that sense that the delay in us bringing it in can mean we can catch up with that and actually put forward the best practice model rather than a model that has proven to haven't had the impact that the countries thought it would have in other jurisdictions.